Begin with a slip knot. Then it's chain a length of chains. Now this length of chains will determine the length of the throw or blanket. So the longer the length, the longer the blanket. And it all depends on how long you'd like that blanket to be. So chain a length of chains as long as need be. So once you've got a length of chains, and I'm just working a sample here, it is a rather big project depending on the length of chains. So I just find it easier to show you with a sample. Then you count the number of chains, and your number of chains should be in multiples of 3 plus 1. So if you count it, it's 3, 6, 9, 12, 15. I've got 18, and here's my plus 1. So make sure that your foundation chain is in multiples of 3 plus 1. Round 1. Into the second chain from the hook, single crochet. So here's my first chain, and that's my second chain, and that's where I'll begin my stitches. But this time here's the front of the chain, and I plan on working round 1 into the back of the chain. If you look at the back, you've got these little bumps that are formed along the back of the chain, and that's where I'll work my stitches. So into that second chain, into that bump that's formed at the back of the chain is where I'll work my first stitch. Insert your hook into that bump, pull up a loop, yarn over, and go through 2 loops on the hook. So you'll continue on with single crochets into these little bumps at the back of the chain to the end of the round. So you'll insert your hook into that little bump, and you may need to help it get through. Yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, go through 2 loops on the hook. Continue with single crochets into those little bumps to the end of the round. Now before I move on any further, that multiples of 3 for my stitch pattern, it doesn't really affect the actual blanket. What it does do is help when it comes to working the edging around the blanket. So that stitch count helps with the edging. And you look, by working our stitches into those little bumps at the back, here's the top of my piece, and here's the bottom edge of my piece, and you see I've got a nice stitch that's formed along the bottom, and that too will help when I'm working the edging. I've worked my way to the end of round 1. Round 2, chain 3, 1, 2, 3, and turn. So for round 2, we're working double crochets all across. We're working those double crochets into the back loops only. So if you look at your stitch, here's the front loop, the loop that's closest to you, and that's your back loop, the one that's away from you. And that's where you will work your stitches. So to work a double crochet, it's yarn over, insert the hook into the stitch, into that back loop, pull up a loop, yarn over, go through 2 loops on the hook, yarn over, go through 2 loops on the hook, and you'll continue on with double crochets into the back loops only to the end of the round. So it's yarn over, insert your hook into the stitch going into that back loop, pull up a loop, yarn over, go through 2 loops on the hook, yarn over, go through 2 loops on the hook. Continue to the end of the round. I've continued on working to the end of round 2. Round 3, chain 1, and turn. So for round 3, we're working single crochets all across, and we're working those single crochets into the back loops only, just as we had done for round 2. So here, that chain 1 counts as a turning chain. My first single crochet will go into that first stitch from where the chain 1 comes out of. So into that back loop from my first stitch is where I'll work my single crochet. And the single crochet is insert your hook into that stitch, going into the back loop only, pull up a loop, yarn over, go through 2 loops on the hook. So you continue with single crochets into the back loops only to the end of the round. I've worked my way to the end of round 3, so here I am right at the end. Now remember that chain 3 that we had worked in the round before, we had started off round 2 with. Here it is. So don't forget to work your last stitch into that third chain from the chain 3, because our chain 3s count as stitches, in this case double crochets. Round 4, chain 3, 1, 2, 3, and that's my first stitch, my first double crochet. So there's no need to work a stitch into that same stitch from where the chain 3 comes out of, because that counts as my first stitch. So you continue on working double crochets into the back loops only to the end of the round. I've continued on working round 3 and round 4 until I have my desired width of my blanket. So you'll do the same. You'll repeat round 3 and round 4 until you have the width that you're looking for. Now I've stopped at a round 4 repeat, which was my round of double crochets, and we'll continue on with the edging from there. So working the edging on the first side, it's chain 3, 1, 2, 3, and turn. Then it's skip the next stitch. So here's the next stitch, and into that next stitch you work a double crochet. Now you'll go back into that skipped stitch, and into that stitch you'll work a puff stitch. So to work a puff stitch, it's yarn over, insert the hook into that stitch, pull up a loop and elongate the loop to about 1 centimeter. Then it's yarn over, insert the hook into the same stitch, pull up a loop, elongate the loop, yarn over, insert the hook into the same stitch, pull up a loop, elongate the loop, yarn over, insert the hook into the same stitch, pull up a loop and elongate the loop. You've done that 4 times. Then it's yarn over and go through all the loops on the hook, and it's a chain 1 to secure. So now my stitch pattern is skip 2. So there's 1, 2, and into that third stitch I'll work a double crochet. So I've got 2 skip stitches in between. Into the last skip stitch, and that's the one closest to the double crochet that I've just worked, I'll work a puff stitch. So again, it's yarn over, insert the hook into that last skip stitch, pull up a loop, elongate the loop to about 1 centimeter, yarn over, insert the hook into that same stitch, pull up a loop and elongate the loop, yarn over, insert the hook into that same stitch, pull up a loop, elongate the loop, yarn over, insert the hook into the same stitch, pull up a loop, elongate the loop, and I've done that 4 times. Yarn over, go through all the loops on the hook and chain 1 to secure. So you continue with the stitch pattern, which is skip 2, 1, 2, and into that third stitch, work a double crochet. Go back into the last skip stitch and work a puff stitch. You continue to the end of side 1. So just a little tip before we move any further with the stitch pattern. So the stitch pattern is skip 2 and into that third stitch, work a double crochet, go back into the skip stitch and work a puff stitch. Now when you're skipping those stitches, be careful not to skip that first double crochet that's right closest to the puff stitch, because even though it may not look like it, you've actually worked your double crochet into that stitch and then you worked your puff behind it. So always remember that that stitch has been taken up by the double crochet. So you'll skip the next 2, 1, 2, and into that third stitch is where you work your double crochet. You'll go back into the skip stitch and you'll work your puff stitch. Always keep that in mind. I've worked my way to the end of the first side. So moving on to the next side or the second side. I've worked that last double crochet into my last double crochet from the round before, and I work the puff stitch into that skip stitch. Then it's chain 2, 1, 2, and I'll turn to the second side. Now here I'm working my stitches, my double crochets, into this row of single crochets that we've worked along the length of the blanket. So this is where I'll work all my double crochets into those rows that I've worked the single crochets at. So in between here, if you look closely, here's the post of the double crochet, and that was my round of single crochets along the blanket. So I've chained 2, and then I'll skip the space in between and I'll get onto that round of single crochets from the blanket, and that's where I'll work my double crochet. Then if you look closely, here's a little gap here, and that's where I'll work the puff stitch into that little gap that's sort of behind the double crochet that I've just worked. Again, into that round where I've worked my single crochets from the blanket, I'll see that little gap here. That's where I'll work my double crochet. And then I'll go back into this little gap next to where I've worked the double crochet, and I'll work the puff stitch. And that's how you continue until you get to the end of side 2. I've worked my way to the end of side 2, and here I am. So then it's chain 2, 1, 2, and turn to side 3. Then it's skip the next 2 stitches and double crochet into the last skip stitch, work your puff stitch, and then you'll continue with that stitch pattern to the end of side 3. I've worked my way to the end of side 3. Then it's chain 2, 1, 2, and turn to side 4. So side 4 and side 2 is the same. We'll be working our double crochets into this row of single crochets from the blanket. into that gap behind the double crochet is where I'll work my puff stitch. So you continue working your double crochets into the rows of single crochets and into the gap behind that. That's where you will work your puff stitch. Continue to the end of side 4. I've continued on working my way to the end of side 4. So here I am right at the end, and I have a little portion unworked. That's fine. I've worked my last puff into that last round of single crochets along the blanket. Then it's chain 2, 1, 2, and into that third chain from chain 3 from where we had started off with. That's where I will slip stitch to join. So then you'll fasten off, cut off the excess yarn. All that's left to do is to weave in all these ends. So with your yarn needle, you'll thread it through, and depending on which side you favor as the front or the back, because both sides really do look good. So here's one side and that's on the other, and you can weave in the ends. So when you're weaving in your ends, the whole idea is to go in and out of the stitches and to sort of lose that end. So I'll choose to weave it into the puff stitches along the edging. And you'll continue on, then you'll cut off the excess yarn, and that's it. You have your crochet blanket or throw.